In the heart of Renaissance Italy, an era of geniuses and titans, while the world rediscovered the beauty of antiquity and dared to dream again, the shadow of medieval dogma still clung to the soul of Europe. The earth remained the unmovable center of divine creation, and the stars mere fixed lights in a perfect firmament. In this universe of unquestionable certainties, a man was born who was destined to break them all. His name was Galileo Galilei, and his story is not just that of a scientist, but that of a rebel who, armed only with his curiosity, dared to point a telescope at the sky and forever change our place in the cosmos. Galileo came into the world on the 15th of February, 1564 in Pisa, a city that carried contradiction in its very architecture with its famous tower defying gravity. It was a time of seismic changes. Gunpowder was redefining war, the printing press was democratizing ideas, and the Protestant Reformation was fracturing Christendom. In this whirlwind, Galileo grew up in a family that valued critical thinking. His father, Vincenzo Galilei, was not only a renowned musician but a theorist who challenged the ancient rules of harmony, a lesson his son would never forget, that the most sacred truths must sometimes be questioned. It was in Florence, the brilliant cradle of the Renaissance, where the young Galileo soaked up this revolutionary spirit. The streets he walked still held the echoes of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, men who had demonstrated that direct observation of nature was the source of all true knowledge. Sent to the University of Pisa to study medicine, a respectable and lucrative career, Galileo soon felt like a prisoner. His mind was not on the ancient texts about humours and bloodletting, but on a language much purer and more universal, mathematics. Legend has it that his epiphany occurred in the Cathedral of Pisa, while observing the languid swing of a bronze lamp. He noticed something that no one else had seen. Using his own pulse to measure time, he discovered that no matter how wide the arc of the swing, the time it took to complete was always the same. In that moment, the medieval physics of Aristotle, which had governed Western thought for nearly 2,000 years, began to crumble in his mind. It was not the authority of ancient books that dictated truth, but the evidence of his own eyes. This discovery ignited a flame. Galileo began to question everything. The Aristotelian idea that heavier objects fall faster seemed illogical to him. He conducted his own experiments, real or mental, challenging his professors and an academy that clung to obsolete dogmas. In the classrooms of Pisa, where tradition was law, Galileo was becoming an intellectual heretic. The cosmos, according to Aristotle and the Church, was perfect and unchanging. But what if it were not? What if the universe were a much more complex and dynamic place than anyone had dared to imagine? The ideas of a Polish astronomer, Nicholas Copernicus, who suggested a universe with the sun at the center, were already circulating in scholarly circles, but they were considered little more than a curious mathematical speculation. For Galileo, however, they represented an exciting possibility. The tension between ancient knowledge and new observations was palpable in the air. His mentors, divided between awe for his genius and fear of its implications, tried to guide him down a safer path, but Galileo's spirit was indomitable. His decision to abandon medicine to fully dedicate himself to mathematics was his first act of rebellion. It was an uncertain path, but it was his. These formative years not only forged his character, but also defined the method that would lead him to glory and ultimately to tragedy. Not to trust authority, but to rely on experimentation. The question that burned within him, what laws govern the universe, or would become the obsession of his life. History often wonders what would have happened if Galileo had followed the safe path. Would modern science have taken decades, or even centuries, to awaken? His courage to challenge conventions not only changed science, it changed the very definition of what it means to seek the truth. With a heart full of questions and a mind sharpened by debate, Galileo prepared for his next step. The prestigious University of Padua awaited him, a place known for its greater intellectual freedom. It would be there that his genius would finally flourish, where he would build the instrument that would allow him to see what no human being had seen before, and where his discoveries would set him on a direct collision course with the greatest power of his time. The journey was just beginning. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. The quest for knowledge led Galileo Galilei to a new chapter in his life, a decisive period for his formation. At the end of the 16th century, Italy was in an environment of intellectual effervescence, marked by the Renaissance. The universities, especially that of Pisa, stood as centers of knowledge, where ancient wisdom intertwined with new ideas that began to challenge dogmas. The Protestant Reformation and the advancement of science began to resonate in academic halls, defying the established order. In this context, Galileo enrolled at the University of Pisa in 1581, initially oriented towards medicine. However, the young Galileo was destined to be more than a physician. His curiosity led him to explore beyond. In the years he would spend in Pisa, he would encounter not only the texts of Aristotle, but also the necessity to question and experiment. The influence of his father, Vincenzo Galilei, a musician and mathematician, would also play a crucial role in his path towards mathematics and physics. The figures who would mark his life during this period were diverse. His first contact with mathematics was through a remarkable professor named Ostilio Ricci, who encouraged his students to investigate. Galileo, under Ricci's tutelage, began to develop a fascination for geometry, feeling that mathematics was the key to understanding the secrets of the universe. However, his path would not be easy. The University of Pisa was dominated by a rigid conception of knowledge. As the years passed, Galileo immersed himself in his studies, but he also began to question the validity of the teachings. In an anecdote that has become part of the myth surrounding him, it is said that while observing a swinging chandelier in the Cathedral of Pisa, Galileo concluded that the time it took to swing was independent of the amplitude of the movement. This discovery, although rudimentary, marked the beginning of his inclination towards experimentation and observation, principles that would later cement his legacy. However, not everything in Pisa was conducive to the development of an inquisitive mind. The rigidity of the educational system and the influence of the authorities generated tension. His decision to abandon medicine and dedicate himself to mathematics was not well received by some, and often his ideas were met with skepticism. The academic community, dominated by Aristotelian tradition, saw in Galileo a threat to their authority. It is pertinent to analyze to what extent a brilliant mind can challenge conventions without facing resistance. In the year 1585, after 4 years of study, Galileo made the decision to leave the University of Pisa without having obtained a degree. This choice, although risky, would be a turning point. His desire to follow the path of mathematics led him to seek new opportunities where he could explore without the limitations imposed by a conservative system. Thus, his life as a student came to a close, leaving a legacy of curiosity and challenge that would accompany him for the rest of his days. The immediate consequences of his time in Pisa were significant. Galileo became a critic of traditional education. The break with medicine and his decision to dedicate himself to mathematics not only positioned him as an independent thinker, but also prepared him for his future career as a professor in Padua. However, the analysis of his years in Pisa persisted, leaving the question in the air about what other secrets awaited in his young mind. Thus, the chapter of his student years closes, but not without leaving a profound mark on the history of science. Tradition and resistance to innovation loomed over Galileo's path, who would soon find himself immersed in a more conducive environment. This journey to the University of Padua, where he would begin to develop his first theories, was just around the corner, and with it, a new era of discoveries and controversies was about to begin. The relentless pursuit of knowledge led Galileo Galilei to a new academic horizon. In 1592, the young scientist moved to the University of Padua, a center of thought that flourished during the Renaissance and would become the stage where his ideas, initially considered radical, would begin to take shape. In an environment of intellectual effervescence where Aristotle and Ptolemy were starting to be questioned, Galileo would find himself at the epicenter of a scientific revolution. The historical context in which Galileo arrived in Padua was complex. Late 16th century Europe was at a crossroads. Religious wars, political tensions, and the resurgence of critical thinking unleashed a torrent of ideas. In Italy, the power of the Catholic Church remained significant, but the seeds of modern science were beginning to germinate. The University of Padua had distinguished itself for its focus on empiricism. Breaking away from pure Aristotelian theory, it was a place where ideas could flourish, but also a battleground where knowledge confronted dogmas. Among the key figures in this story is Galileo himself, who had developed a deep interest in mathematics and physics. His decision to dedicate himself to teaching mathematics in Padua was an act of courage and curiosity. He would become the first mathematics professor in the history of the university to receive a salary, granting him an unusual independence. But other actors were also present, the academics who clung to old traditions and the university system itself, which, although innovative, was still under the watchful eye of the church. In his new position, Galileo began to develop his first theories, exploring concepts that challenged traditional notions of motion. It was in this environment that he formulated his ideas on the fall of bodies, arguing that all objects, regardless of their weight, fall at the same speed in the absence of air resistance. This principle, which contradicted Aristotelian teachings, was the first step toward the formulation of what we now know as the law of gravity. The development of these concepts was not an easy path. Galileo faced resistance from his colleagues who were reluctant to abandon the legacy of Aristotle. However, his charisma and ability to communicate complex ideas earned him both admirers and detractors. In the classrooms of Padua, his theories began to resonate, and the curiosity of his students was ignited. It is pertinent to analyze whether the academy was ready to accept a new way of understanding the universe. Events unfolded rapidly. In 1593, Galileo presented his first significant discovery, the use of the hydrostatic balance, an innovation that allowed him to measure the density of bodies. This advancement not only enhanced his reputation but also laid the groundwork for future research. But the real mystery lay in the questions that still lingered in the air. What other secrets of the universe awaited discovery? How would his theories change the perception of the world? The immediate consequences of his work in Padua were profound. Galileo began to attract attention not only from his students but also from patrons and scholars. His focus on observation and experimentation gave rise to a new way of doing science. However, this same boldness also generated tensions. Galileo's ideas, although innovative, were viewed with skepticism and, in some circles, with open hostility. At the end of this chapter, a question arises. Could a man, armed only with curiosity, truly challenge centuries of established thought? As tradition loomed over him, the quest for scientific truth began to take an irrevocable course. At this point, Galileo's journey would lead him to an invention that would forever change the course of science, the telescope. It is pertinent to analyze how a simple tool could transform his vision of the cosmos and unleash a controversy that would resonate through the centuries. The answer, as we will soon discover, lies among the stars. The quest for knowledge found its most powerful tool. In 2609, amidst a climate of uncertainty and change, Galileo Galilei delved into astronomical observation. Europe was a continent marked by the scientific revolution. Ancient beliefs, upheld by an Aristotelian tradition and a geocentric view, began to wobble. In this context, Galileo, the mathematician and philosopher from Padua, found himself at the pinnacle of a revolution that extended beyond physics. It was a paradigm shift. The invention of the telescope by Galileo occurred at a time when intellectual curiosity intertwined with the discoveries of other thinkers. Although he is not credited with the creation of the telescope, It was he who, upon learning of a device that magnified vision, decided to perfect it. This instrument, developed by lens makers in the Netherlands, would transform into the vehicle for a new understanding of the cosmos. In his laboratory, Galileo worked to improve the design, adding lenses that allowed for observations with a clarity never before imagined. Galileo's first telescope, built in 2609, had a magnification of approximately 20 times. However, its true potential revealed itself on the starry nights of Italy. With the telescope in hand, Galileo did not merely observe, he began to unravel the secrets that the universe offered him. His initial observations of the moon revealed a world filled with mountains and craters, challenging the Aristotelian vision of spherical perfection, but it was his observation of Jupiter and its moons, which began in January of 2010, that would change the conception of the cosmos. The discovery of the 4 moons of Jupiter, which Galileo named Medici moons in honor of his patrons, was a significant blow against the geocentric model of Ptolemy. It is pertinent to analyze what this meant for the view of the universe in which the Earth occupied the center. That finding not only provided evidence that other celestial bodies orbited a planet different from Earth, but it also questioned the uniqueness of the human being. By observing the movements of these moons, Galileo began to draw a line that separated science from dogma. However, each discovery brought its own consequences. The scientific community, still anchored in traditional beliefs, was not prepared to accept Galileo's claims. The opposition came not only from his scientific contemporaries but also from the Catholic Church, which saw in his assertions a threat to its authority. In this atmosphere, Galileo faced a dilemma: the desire to share his findings and the fear of repercussions. The invention of the telescope was not merely a technological advance. It was an open door to a new world, but also to an abyss of controversies. It is debated whether a simple instrument could change humanity's perception of its place in the universe and what other secrets awaited in space. The answer to these questions lay in the inquisitive mind of Galileo and in the fate that awaited him. The immediate consequences of his discoveries were profound. Admiration for Galileo grew in some circles, especially among nobles and intellectuals. However, the influence of the church loomed over his work, and his relationship with the clergy became tense. The vision of a universe centered on the earth began to crumble. But conservative forces were determined to maintain the status quo. The question arising from these events was clear: how would Galileo confront the growing pressure from an institution that vehemently defended its doctrine? The invention of the telescope had opened a new chapter, but it had also ignited a spark of conflict that threatened to consume its creator. As Galileo's telescope rose, the stars seemed closer, but the pressure from a world unwilling to accept the challenge was also felt. With each observation, the tension grew, and the repercussions of his discovery resonated among those who dared to look beyond. In the next chapter, Galileo would embark on a journey, making observations that would not only change astronomy but also unleash a wave of controversy. As his discoveries became public, the impact of his work would begin to resonate throughout Europe, paving the way for a confrontation that would mark the history of science. The revolution in observation led Galileo Galilei on an astronomical journey that would challenge the beliefs of his time. In a world where the geocentric view of Aristotle and Ptolemy prevailed, the backdrop of 17th century Europe was marked by tensions and a thirst for knowledge. The Renaissance had awakened an interest in the sciences, but the Catholic Church still influenced bold thinkers. In this context, Galileo would begin to unravel the mysteries of the cosmos. The first stars that dazzled him were those orbiting around Jupiter. In January of 1610, armed with his telescope, Galileo focused his gaze on this gas giant. What he discovered was a challenge to the conception of the universe: 4 moons that revolved around Jupiter, known as the Galilean moons: Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. This finding was not only an astronomical phenomenon, but also a blow to the notion that all celestial bodies orbited the Earth. Galileo In his work, Sidereus Nuncius would publish these observations, describing how the stars that danced around Jupiter behaved similarly to how the Earth orbited the Sun. The reaction of the world was a mix of astonishment and fear. Defenders of the geocentric model, both at court and in the church, would begin to question the validity of his discoveries and to challenge humanity's place in the universe. Meanwhile, another of his discoveries, the phases of Venus, would become a pillar for Copernicus's heliocentric argument. Galileo observed how Venus presented phases similar to those of the Moon, a phenomenon that could only be explained if Venus orbited the Sun. In each phase, the planet displayed a different aspect, revealing its nature as a body that experienced changes in its illumination. This finding was not only remarkable but also refuted the Ptolemaic model. As his discoveries accumulated, so did the controversy. Academic and ecclesiastical circles began to question not only the veracity of his observations but also their philosophical and theological implications. In a Europe where faith and reason were in tension, the idea that the Earth was not the center of the universe unleashed chain reactions. It is pertinent to analyze what would happen if the heliocentric model were established as the new truth, and how this would affect the interpretation of the scriptures and the authority of the Church. The immediate consequences of these revelations were both academic and personal. Galileo became a focal point of debate, a man at the crossroads between science and faith. His observations challenged not only the understanding of the cosmos, but also the social order. However, in this quest, Galileo faced a dilemma: loyalty to observation or submission to authorities. His path was marked by ambiguity, where genius and heresy could be two sides of the same coin. The question emerging from these events was profound. Could science coexist with faith? The story of Galileo is not only that of an astronomer, but also that of a man who dared to look beyond his time. His journey through the cosmos not only revealed new worlds, but also illuminated the corners of ignorance. With the publication of his discoveries, the figure of Galileo would become a symbol of the struggle between knowledge and oppression. But what remained to be unveiled was how these observations would influence his life. The next stage of his journey would lead him to a new horizon, where the controversy with the Church would intensify. In this scenario, the words of the philosopher could resonate more strongly than ever. And yet it moves. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. The revolution in the way of viewing the cosmos became a force that would resonate in classrooms and in the minds of those who dared to look towards the sky. In the year 1610, Galileo Galilei, empowered by his recent discoveries, was about to take a monumental step. His desire to share his observations and challenge traditional conceptions would lead him to publish his most famous work, the Sidereus Nuncius, known in Spanish as the Mensajero Sideral. The historical context in which this publication arises is fundamental. Europe, in the first part of the 17th century, was immersed in religious tensions. The Protestant Reformation had challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, which struggled to maintain its power in a world leaning towards reasoning. In this environment, scientific knowledge emerged as a tool to understand the universe, but also as a threat to dogmas. The figure of Galileo was not only that of an astronomer, he stood as a symbol of the new era of critical thinking. The key figures in this narrative are not limited to Galileo. Among them is the Medici family, one of the most powerful dynasties, which would play a crucial role in supporting Galilean ideas. On the other hand, the figure of Cardinal Roberto Bellarmino, defender of orthodoxy, loomed over scientific advances, representing the interests of a church that saw in Galileo's discoveries a threat. Galileo's decision to publish his observations was an act of courage. The writing of the Sidereus Nuncius was an attempt to elevate the status of science through empirical evidence. In this treatise, Galileo documented his observations, revealing the 4 moons of Jupiter and the phases of Venus. These discoveries not only challenged the geocentric view, but also offered evidence supporting Copernicus's heliocentric model. The work was written in Latin, which made it accessible to scholars and placed it at the center of a growing controversy. The development of the events surrounding the publication was marked by a mix of astonishment and opposition. By presenting his work to the scientific community and to the Medici court, Galileo managed to capture the attention of many. However, his success was not without criticism. The publication generated a torrent of reactions. While some celebrated his boldness, others viewed his findings as heresy, questioning the interpretation of scriptures and traditional cosmology. The immediate consequences were profound. At a time when knowledge was a battlefield between faith and reason, the mensajero sideral became a symbol of new thought. Galileo had ignited the spark of a debate that would extend, inviting society to question what they believed they knew. However, this very act attracted the attention of the Church, which would begin to feel the pressure to defend its position. The question surrounding this phase of Galileo's life lies in the contradiction between the recognition of his genius and the growing opposition. It is pertinent to analyze why, despite the evidence, resistance to his findings persisted and what secrets awaited in the depths of faith and reason. The answer delves into the territory of the conflict that would soon materialize. As the repercussions of the Sidereus Nuncius reverberated, Galileo found himself at a crossroads. His relationship with the powerful Medici family had elevated him, but the recognition of his work also attracted unwanted attention. The pursuit of scientific truth would lead him to an inevitable confrontation with the structures of power that had dominated the interpretation of the cosmos. The next stage of his life would reveal not only the cost of the pursuit of knowledge, but also the price of challenging conventions. Thus, the legacy of Galileo began to take shape, but so did the resistance that would haunt him. With the emergence of a new paradigm, a conflict was brewing that would mark the fate of science and religion. In the following chapter, we will delve into Galileo's connection with the influential Medici family and how their support could have been both a blessing and a curse. The growing notoriety that Galileo Galilei had achieved with the publication of his Sidereus Nuncius not only captured the attention of scholars, but also resonated in the halls of power of Renaissance Florence. In a world where science and art flourished under the protection of influential families, the support of the Medici emerged as an essential springboard for consolidating his status. It is pertinent to analyze what this connection truly meant for Galileo and his work. By the end of the 16th century, Florence was at the height of its cultural splendor, an epicenter of innovation. The Medici family, under the leadership of Cosimo II, had secured their influence not only through wealth, but also by patronizing artists and scientists. This socio-political context, laden with opportunities, was fertile ground for a man like Galileo to thrive. However, the path to the Medici court was not straightforward. The Medici were aware of the value that scientific knowledge could bring to their legacy. By establishing a relationship with Galileo, they sought not only validation for their astrological beliefs, but also a way to strengthen their control over intellectuals. It was a power play where science became a tool of prestige. Thus, when Galileo presented himself before them, he did so not only as an astronomer, but as a potential ally. The climax of this relationship occurred when Galileo was appointed mathematician and philosopher of the court. This appointment not only granted him a privileged status, but also provided him with the financial security to continue his research. In a symbolic gesture, Galileo dedicated his work Sidereus Nuncius to Cosimo II, in an attempt to seal this alliance. However, it is pertinent to analyze what the price of this support was and what commitments were forged. As Galileo delved into the Florentine court, his relationship with the Medici began to take shape. The family, eager to present themselves as protectors of science, organized events where the astronomer could present his discoveries. In these gatherings, the brightest minds of the time convened, and Galileo, with his wit, captured everyone's attention. However, this closeness also brought a risk, the need to pave his way with the approval of his benefactors. Every observation he made was, in some way, a reflection of the interests of his sponsors. The support of the Medici was not limited to financial patronage. It also manifested in the way Galileo could disseminate his ideas. The court became a social laboratory, but in this ecosystem, tensions were palpable. The Medici family, although eager to elevate their status, also had to navigate the waters of a society where traditional beliefs clashed with new revelations. Thus, every step Galileo took was imbued with a challenge. Could his theories survive such deeply rooted tradition? The relationship between Galileo and the Medici was not without complications. As his observations challenged the geocentric view, the repercussions were felt not only in the scientific realm but also in the religious one. The family, by aligning themselves with a man whose theories could call ecclesiastical doctrine into question, found themselves at a crossroads. It was a dangerous game, and the question was whether science and faith could coexist. Galileo, aware of the tensions, tried to maintain a balance. His desire to advance science had to be weighed against the need not to alienate his sponsors. Thus, his observations resonated, but they also raised questions about how far he was willing to go to protect his legacy and what sacrifices he would have to make. The immediate impact of this relationship became evident. Galileo, now a man of prestige, began to attract other scientists. The court became a center of debate where science began to be seen as a means to challenge the status quo. However, this new light also brought the darkness of opposition. The church, increasingly uneasy, would begin to watch him, preparing for a confrontation. At the heart of this story lies a question that persists. The connection between Galileo and the Medici, seemingly a mutually beneficial bond, becomes a deeper theme. It is debated whether it was genuine support or a strategy to maintain control. Every decision seemed to be wrapped in uncertainty. Thus, as Galileo navigated the intricate power relations in Florence, the influence of the church began to extend. The conflict was about to unfold. The question that arises is how one man, armed only with his telescope, could challenge one of the most powerful forces of the time. With this unsettling premise, the next chapter will take us to the heart of the conflict brewing between Galileo and the Catholic Church, a confrontation that would not only test his theories but also define his legacy. The growing notoriety of Galileo attracted the attention not only of admirers but also of adversaries. As his discoveries spread, a threat began to loom over his figure. The Catholic Church, the institution that had guided morality and knowledge in Europe for centuries, found itself in a moment of crisis. The Protestant Reformation had challenged its authority, and the emergence of new scientific ideas threatened to destabilize the order. In this context, the conflict between Galileo and the Church was brewing as an issue that would transcend the boundaries of time. The 17th century was a period of intellectual effervescence. In Italy, the figure of Galileo shone. His astronomical observations rose above ignorance. However, the Church, still clinging to the geocentric model of Ptolemy, perceived in his findings not only a scientific challenge, but a threat to its theological power. Heliocentrism not only contradicted centuries of doctrine, but also jeopardized the power of those who stood as interpreters of divine will. Key figures in this narrative include Galileo, a bold scientist, and Urban VIII, the Pope who had initially been an ally. Urban, a man of letters, found himself at a crossroads. The decision to allow or restrict the advancement of knowledge rested on his shoulders. The complexity of the relationship between the two men would play a crucial role in the outcome. In the year 1616, the tension reached a critical point. The Congregation of the Holy Office, the body responsible for safeguarding orthodoxy, was compelled to pronounce on heliocentric ideas. In a meeting that would resonate through history, Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, a prominent member of the Inquisition, presented himself before Galileo and warned him about the danger of promoting heliocentrism. The warning was clear: Galileo's ideas could be considered heretical. However, Galileo, with his faith in science, dismissed the warning. The following years were marked by a tug-of-war between scientific curiosity and ecclesiastical authority. In the year 1620, Galileo published the Assayer, a treatise where he defended the primacy of sensory experience over the interpretation of sacred texts. The work was a hymn to reason, but also a challenge. The Church began to see in his work not only a threat, but a manifestation of disobedience. As his work spread, his discoveries began to divide public opinion. Defenders of science applauded Galileo. However, the more conservative sectors, including many within the Church, began to see him as an enemy. The tension was palpable, and the horizon darkened with the imminent confrontation. The year 1624 marked a milestone. Urban VIII, who had been a defender of Galileo, felt betrayed by the publication of Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, where Galileo presented a defense of heliocentrism. The Pope, feeling ridiculed, changed his stance. The complexity of the relationship between Galileo and the Church deepened. It was debated whether a man could challenge divine authority in the name of reason. The immediate consequences of this growing tension were palpable. In the year 1626, the Inquisition initiated a formal investigation. The atmosphere became dense. The struggle between faith and reason was not only fought in academic halls, but also in the minds of those observing. Fearful of the repercussions of this confrontation would reverberate through the centuries. It is pertinent to analyze how it is possible that knowledge and faith, two fundamental pillars, found themselves on such a conflicting path. In the search for answers, the story of Galileo becomes a subject of reflection. It is debated whether his courage was an act of heroism or recklessness, as the figure of Galileo rose as a hope for some. For others, he was a symbol of defiance. The tension that accumulated was not only a reflection of his individual struggle, but a microcosm of a cultural battle. History leaves us with a question: who are the true guardians of truth? As the chapter of the relationship between Galileo and the Church intensified, the next step will take us to Galileo's passionate defense in his letter to Cristina of Lorraine, where he will attempt to reconcile science with faith. The growing tension between Galileo and the Church intensified. At the heart of this storm, the scientist, having reaped the fruits of his work in Padua, found himself in a delicate balance between science and faith. The opposition from the Catholic Church, which perceived his discoveries as an attack on the literal interpretation of the Scriptures, brought him to a critical point. In this context, a voice would rise seeking to reconcile reason with faith, that of Galileo in his letter to Cristina of Lorraine. The political and religious atmosphere of the early 17th century in Europe was a mix of fervour, dynastic rivalries, and a struggle for intellectual power. The Counter-Reformation had sharpened the tensions between the Church and thinkers who dared to question it. In this context, the figure of Cristina of Lorraine, Grand Duchess of Tuscany, became a beacon of diplomacy. Cristina, an educated and astute woman, represented a crucial link between the scientific and religious worlds. Her support could be salvation for Galileo or his condemnation. Galileo's letter, written in 1615, was not simply a defense of his discoveries. It was an attempt to bridge the gap between science and theology, an act of courage. In his words, Galileo outlines a provocative idea: scientific findings, far from contradicting the Bible, could coexist with it. Sacred scripture, he writes, teaches us how to go to heaven, not how heaven goes. This phrase encapsulated his attempt to divert the conflict towards a more flexible interpretation, suggesting that the understanding of nature should not be seen as a threat to faith. The key figures in this drama were Galileo, with his restless mind, and Cristina, whose role as intermediary was fundamental. Galileo's decision to address her evidenced his keen perception of the dynamics of power. However, it also revealed the desperation of a man who knew that his ideas could lead him to ruin. The letter was not only an attempt to save his reputation, but a plea for science and faith to coexist. As events unfolded, Galileo presented his discoveries, revealing how the telescope had opened a new window to cosmic reality. The moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, and sunspots were irrefutable evidence that challenged the geocentric model. Through the correspondence, one can sense his anguish at seeing how his colleagues and the church clung to ancient beliefs. The letter, written with a tone of respectful persuasion, became an act of intellectual defiance. Galileo, aware of the possible repercussions, chose his words carefully. However, despite the eloquence of his arguments, the immediate consequences were not favorable. Although Cristina showed interest, the pressure from the church and politics began to surround the scientist. The letter, instead of opening a dialogue, became a double-edged sword. As tensions rose, Galileo realized that his defense of the compatibility between science and religion could be seen as a provocation. The question that arises from this story is profound. Could science truly coexist with an inflexible religious doctrine? The letter to Cristina of Lorraine stood as a testament to Galileo's struggle not only for his ideas but for a future where knowledge and faith could intertwine. It is debated whether this letter was an act of courage or a desperate move. With the tension palpable in the air, Galileo embarked on an uncertain path. What would come next would be even more dramatic. In the following chapter, we will explore how this struggle for truth would lead Galileo to confront the Inquisition for the first time, marking a milestone in his life and in the history of science. The battle between faith and reason was about to reach its climax. The growing tension between science and religion, fueled by the discoveries of Galileo, attracted the attention of ecclesiastical authorities. In the year 1616, a concern resonated in the halls of the Vatican, where heliocentrism began to be considered not only a scientific challenge but a possible assault on faith. The figure of Galileo, already known for his boldness, found himself at the center of a situation that threatened his career and his life. The historical context of this period was complex. Europe was engulfed in religious and political conflicts. The Protestant Reformation had divided the continent, and the Catholic Counter-Reformation sought to restore the hegemony of Catholicism. In this climate of distrust and dogmatism, the Inquisition stood as a feared power. The idea that a scientist could challenge the truths established by the Church was an act of rebellion that needed to be investigated. In this scenario, key figures stand out. Cardinal Roberto Bellarmino, one of the most influential figures in the Roman Curia, emerged as the defender of orthodoxy. Bellarmino, known for his scholarship, would be one of the main actors in the search for answers regarding Galileo's theories. His decision to investigate the astronomer would mark the beginning of a process that would raise questions about the relationship between science and religion. The development of the events that led to the first inquiry of Galileo began with the formal denunciation of his ideas. In the year 1616, the Inquisitor of Florence received a report about Galileo's claims. It was the moment of truth. The Inquisition could not ignore the challenge of heliocentrism. In a crucial meeting, Bellarmino met with Galileo, who was warned about the implications of his claims. At this crossroads, he was asked to keep his ideas private. It was an ultimatum. Science and faith could not coexist in public discourse. However, the pressure could not silence his curiosity. Despite the warning, Galileo's spirit led him to continue his investigations. But in an unexpected turn, the Inquisition did not act immediately. The case was closed without serious consequences, a surprising decision that left many questioning the true reason. It is debated whether it was the lack of evidence or a deeper fear of what knowledge could unleash. The immediate consequences of this episode were significant. Galileo continued his work, but the influence of the Inquisition loomed over him, creating an atmosphere of tension. The Church, by choosing not to act, left open the possibility that science and faith could coexist, albeit at a high cost. The figure of Galileo became a symbol of the struggle for truth, but also a reminder of the risks of challenging authority. The question that remained after the first inquiry of Galileo raised unsettling questions. What secrets awaited in the depths of human knowledge? Could it be possible that scientific truth could be bent by faith? Undoubtedly, these questions would resonate, setting the stage for even more dramatic events. With the curtain lifted on the first inquiry, Galileo's path would become more complicated. The tension between his discoveries and religious orthodoxy would continue to grow, and he would soon be forced to face a tribunal that would decide his fate. In the next chapter, we will explore Galileo's seminal work, the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, where his theories would be put to the test. The First Inquisition manifested itself more incisively, deepening the tension between scientific thought and established doctrines. In the brilliance of 17th century Europe, a tumultuous continent where science began to outline its independence, Galileo Galilei found himself at the pinnacle of his career. The year 1632 would mark a decisive milestone, the publication of his most famous work, the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, where the Ptolemaic and Copernican views would confront each other, generating a resonance that would echo throughout history. Contextually, Europe was caught between the Middle Ages and modernity. The Protestant Reformation had fragmented Christian unity, unleashing debates that shook the foundations of faith. In this environment, the pursuit of scientific knowledge was not only an intellectual endeavor, but also an act of defiance against hierarchies. Galileo's work resonated not only in academic circles, but also became a flashpoint. The image of a heliocentric universe challenged not only the literal interpretation of scriptures, but also the very conception of humanity's place in the universe. The characters who would play crucial roles in this drama were Galileo, a bold scientist, and his contemporaries, the prominent figures of the Church. Among them was Cardinal Roberto Bellarmine, a fervent defender of Catholicism who saw heliocentrism as a threat. Galileo's decision to present his ideas in the form of a dialogue was a deliberate move, a strategy to attract a broader audience, attempting to seduce even his detractors. The development of the dialogue was not a mere academic exercise. Galileo structured the work in 3 dialogues between Salviati, Sagredo, and Simplicio. Through them, he presented the evidence in favor of the Copernican system, contrasting it with the Ptolemaic model. This approach not only allowed Galileo to present his arguments in an accessible manner, but also offered him a shield. By disguising his ideas, he sought to protect himself from the possible wrath of the Church. The astronomical observations that Galileo had made, such as the phases of Venus and the moons of Jupiter, were more than mere curiosities. They were the core of his argumentation, a set of empirical proofs that challenged dogma. The work was received with enthusiasm by many, but also with growing unease in high circles. The publication of the dialogue not only reinforced Galileo's position, but also ignited the flame of controversy. It was debated whether the pursuit of knowledge should be subordinated to faith. His challenge reverberated, generating a tense atmosphere. However, the immediate consequences of this work went beyond that. Although many were drawn to Galileo's ideas, the reaction of the Church was forceful. As the popularity of the dialogue increased, so did the scrutiny on Galileo. The tension mounted, and the conflict between his desire for free thought and the authority of the Church became inevitable. It is pertinent to analyze whether Galileo could maintain his scientific integrity without sacrificing his safety. The question that the publication of the dialogue left hanging was profound. How far is a man willing to go in the pursuit of truth? It was clear that Galileo had crossed a line, but the cost of his boldness had yet to be revealed. His work would become a symbol of the struggle between reason and faith, and the influence of the Inquisition began to extend over his figure. Thus, with the tension palpable in the air, the next chapter loomed. The Inquisition, which had left its mark on many thinkers, was prepared to address the figure of Galileo more directly. On the horizon loomed the trial of 1633, where the scientist would be forced to defend not only his ideas but his very freedom. The publication of the dialogue reached its climax in a dark setting where reason would clash with faith. In the year 1633, the innovative ideas of Galileo Galilei resonated throughout Europe, unleashing both admiration and fury. The scientific revolution he had initiated, driven by his defense of heliocentrism, threatened the structures of power. The Catholic Church, defender of a geocentric cosmos, found itself at a crossroads, and Galileo's fate hung by a thread. The historical context surrounding the trial was complex. At the beginning of the 17th century, Europe was engulfed in a struggle between religious dogma and the emergence of new scientific ideas. The Counter-Reformation sought to reaffirm the authority of the Church. In this climate, the defense of heliocentrism was considered not only a heresy, but an attack on biblical interpretation. The main actors in this story were not just individuals. At the heart of the Inquisition was Cardinal Roberto Bellarmino, a key figure who had been aware of Galileo's teachings. Bellarmino, a fervent defender of the faith, had warned Galileo about the consequences of his teachings in the year 1616, when the astronomer was cautioned that his view should be presented as a hypothesis. Despite this warning, Galileo continued his quest, which led him to publish the Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. Against the backdrop of rising tension, Galileo's trial began on the 12th of April in the year 1633. The Inquisition summoned him to Rome, where he was formally accused of heresy. The courtroom was a somber space. The judges, mostly members of the clergy, sat with their gaze fixed on the man who had dared to challenge doctrine. In this hostile environment, Galileo presented himself as a weary but resolute man. During the hearings, the interrogations intensified. Galileo, despite his wit, found himself in a vulnerable position. The Inquisition had decided that his ideas posed a direct threat. As the days passed, the weight of the pressure became palpable. Galileo's defense consisted of arguing that his intention had never been to contradict the Bible, but to seek the truth through observation. However, this defense did not seem sufficient. In a dramatic turn, the Inquisition presented a key witness, Galileo's dialogue, which, despite its style, contained assertions that challenged the literal interpretation of the scriptures. The court, eager to demonstrate its power, used his own words against him. The figure of Galileo, once venerated, transformed before the eyes of the Church into a symbol of defiance. The immediate consequences were devastating. Galileo was sentenced to imprisonment, although due to his advanced age, the sentence was converted to house arrest. However, the repercussions of this conviction would extend far beyond. His case became a symbol of the struggle between science and religion, raising questions that would resonate through the centuries about how far religious power was willing to go and what the cost of seeking truth would be. The central question of the chapter looms over us. It is debated whether Galileo was a heretic or simply a man who dared to see the world differently. History leaves us with a reflection on the price of knowledge in a world that clings to tradition. As Galileo's story unfolds, his house arrest in the Villa of Arcetri awaits us, where new ideas will take shape. It is pertinent to analyze how this confinement will affect his work and his legacy. The answer leads us to the next chapter, where we will explore Galileo's life after his conviction in a state of seclusion that could give rise to one of the most productive stages of his career. The trial of Galileo reached its climax. In the year 1633, the atmosphere in Catholic Europe was permeated with tensions fueled by the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. The Inquisition, an instrument of ecclesiastical power, had become more incisive, and the ideas of Galileo Galilei, with his defense of heliocentrism, were in the crosshairs. The certainty of the geocentric doctrine, which had dominated thought, began to wobble. However, the Catholic Church was not willing to cede its authority. The historical context in which Galileo operated was one of growing conflict. In this scenario, the figure of Pope Urban VIII stood out as a central character. Known for his erudition, Urban had been an old admirer of Galileo. However, the Pope felt betrayed when Galileo published his Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, a work that was perceived as a defense of the heliocentric model. The work not only challenged the view of the universe, but also called into question the literal interpretation of the scriptures. When the Inquisition summoned Galileo in 1633, Condemnation seemed imminent. In the court, the pressure was unbearable. The Inquisitor asked him if he maintained his claims. In a dramatic scene, Galileo, aware of the implications, was forced to recant. The words caught in his throat. "I renounce my opinions," he whispered, as the room fell into silence. This act was not only a surrender to the Church, but also a betrayal of his own convictions. The characters surrounding this event were complex. Cardinal Bellarmine, a fervent defender of orthodoxy, had been one of the first to confront Galileo. His figure symbolized the resistance of the Church. On the other hand, the figure of Galileo himself became tragic. A man who had challenged conventions now found himself at a crossroads, forced to choose between his integrity and his life. The development of these events was rapid. As the pressure increased, the evidence of his discoveries became a distant echo. Hearings followed, evidence was presented, and finally Galileo's recantation not only freed him from severe punishment, but also trapped him in a labyrinth of contradictions. Condemnation was imminent. But the punishment was not the stake. Instead, Galileo was sentenced to house arrest, a fate that would grant him time to reflect but also solitude. The immediate consequences were far-reaching. Galileo's recantation became a symbol of the struggle between reason and faith. Although he managed to avoid death, his renunciation of the ideas he had defended left a stain on his legacy. His credibility was questioned, and the scientific community faced a dilemma: to follow the path of Galileo or to conform. Faith and reason seemed irreconcilable. The question that emerges from this dramatic scene is profound. What price was a man willing to pay for his life compared to his beliefs? There is debate over whether Galileo's recantation was a betrayal or an act of survival. As the questions linger, it becomes clear that the struggle between science and faith was not limited to a single individual. As the Inquisition withdrew, Galileo's words still reverberated. His renunciation, though painful, would not stop the advance of knowledge. However, the suffering of the man who had challenged the Church would not be forgotten. His legacy, though tarnished, would continue to inspire future generations. The story of Galileo, marked by this episode, leads us to a new phase. Confined in his home in Arcetri, the scientist would not give up. What follows is a journey of redemption, where Galileo's mind will find new ways to explore the universe. In the next chapter, we will unveil how science flourishes in the shadow of house arrest. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. The trial of Galileo would soon reach its climax, leading him to a grim fate and at the same time to an unexpected refuge. Following his abjuration in 1633, the acclaimed astronomer found himself under house arrest in his villa in Arcetri, a place that would become the prison of his brilliant mind. The conviction not only marked the end of his public life, it also outlined a new chapter where silence would transform into the incubator of new ideas. The political and social environment of 17th century Italy was a battlefield of beliefs. The Catholic Church, with its authority, was in a constant struggle to maintain its power in the face of the advance of science. Heliocentrism, defended by Galileo, was seen as a threat not only to the theological worldview but also to the structure of ecclesiastical power. In this context, the Inquisition stood as the guardian of orthodoxy. It is pertinent to analyze what significance the condemnation of a man who had challenged the heavens held. Galileo, after his trial, retreated to his villa in Arcetri, a place of serene beauty. The Inquisition's decision to confine him was both an act of punishment and an attempt to silence him. However, there, in his new existence, the scientist would continue his work, turning his isolation into an opportunity. It is debated whether silence was, in fact, a manifestation of new revelations. Upon his arrival in Arcetri, repression surrounded him, but it was also a space where nature and reflection could intertwine. In this environment, Galileo dedicated himself to writing and research, challenging limitations. His mind, far from being captive, seemed to feed on adversity. The villa became a laboratory of ideas, where observation and critical thinking would continue to flourish. The figures who decided Galileo's fate were powerful individuals. The Inquisition, represented by Cardinal Roberto Bellarmino, had drawn a clear line. The defense of heliocentrism was heresy, and Galileo had to be an example. The pressure from the Church and the fear of excommunication were decisive. However, amid this storm, Galileo's figure rose as a beacon of intellectual resistance. It is pertinent to analyze whether, through his silence, he could communicate something even more powerful. The months in Arcetri passed, and although the arrest limited his interaction, ideas continued to spring forth. Curiosity and the desire to understand the universe could not be extinguished. In his seclusion, Galileo began to work on one of his most significant works, discourses and mathematical demonstrations concerning two new sciences, where he would explore mechanics and motion. Each page was a manifestation of rebellion against dogma. The immediate consequences of his arrest were evident. The Inquisition had managed to restrict his public influence, but the spark of his genius was not extinguished. Instead, the flames of critical thought were ignited in his villa. His work, although written in isolation, would resonate in the minds of those who yearned for knowledge. His influence would begin to cross borders, challenging the status quo. However, Galileo's arrest not only created a void in science, but also left an unresolved question. It is debated how much knowledge was lost due to his forced silence, and whether his theories could have evolved even further had he been free. History is often written with lost possibilities, and Galileo's house arrest became one of those blank pages. Thus, as his figure faded in the scientific debate, the question grew about the impact of his seclusion. It is analysed whether the legacy of this genius would be a testament to the struggle against oppression, or simply a reminder of what could have been. The story of Galileo, caught between duty and passion, intertwined with the discourse on freedom of thought. Over time, the situation began to clear, and in his confinement, Galileo became a symbol of the struggle for intellectual freedom. His life, marked by adversity, not only left a mark on science, but also raised questions about the relationship between knowledge and power. It is pertinent to analyze how much more could have been discovered had silence not been imposed. As Galileo continued his research in solitude, the outside world kept turning. The ideas he had sown before his conviction began to germinate. The next chapter of his life, marked by creation, will lead us to explore how, despite the chains, the spirit of Galileo would continue to challenge the minds of his time. The uncertainty that loomed over Galileo Galilei was not merely the result of the trial. It was a manifestation of a tumultuous time where science and faith grappled in a struggle for control of understanding. The house arrest at his villa in Arcetri, far from being the end of his quest, became a space for reflection and discovery. In those silent hours, Galileo did not just count the days, he delved into the mysteries of motion. The historical context of this stage is fundamental. At the beginning of the 17th century, Europe found itself at a crossroads. The Protestant Reformation had shaken the foundations of the Catholic Church, and religious dogma was being questioned. However, the resistance came from the heart of the ecclesiastical institution, which saw in the new ideas a threat. In this climate, Galileo, now considered a heretic, found himself trapped in his own quest for truth. The characters surrounding this story are, on one hand, the inquisitors who had judged him, and on the other, Galileo himself, a man who had dedicated his life to unraveling the secrets of the universe. Upon being sentenced to house arrest, the decision of the Inquisition not only prohibited him from teaching, but also sought to silence him. However, this limitation did not succeed in extinguishing his curiosity. The decisions of his captors, far from condemning him to inaction, sowed in him a renewed determination. During his confinement, Galileo dedicated himself to research and writing. His mind, always restless, could not find peace. In his notes, he began to outline principles that would later be known as the laws of motion. The fall of bodies and inertia became the core of his studies. It is pertinent to analyze how a man in prison could challenge the laws of physics that seemed unmovable. The answer lay in his method, observation and mathematical reasoning. The development of events during this stage was remarkable. With the use of simple materials, Galileo began to experiment with the motion of bodies. Through his observations, he discovered that the speed of a falling object did not depend on its weight, as had been believed, but on the height from which it fell. This finding, which challenged Aristotelian teachings, became the cornerstone of his new theory. As the days turned into weeks, his passion for science was fueled by the challenge. The immediate consequences of these investigations were profound. Galileo was not only beginning to lay the foundations of modern physics, but he was also keeping alive the flame of curiosity at a time when fear could silence many. His work, although written in solitude, would become the foundation upon which the thoughts of future generations would be built. However, doubt remained, and the question persisted as to whether his ingenuity would be sufficient to change the course of history. The question surrounding this phase of his life is undeniable. There is debate over the extent to which Galileo's confinement may have fueled his creativity and desire to challenge conventions. As he labored over his experiments, the figure of the scientist stood as a guide amid dogmatism. The story of Galileo is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In a world where truth was a luxury, his legacy began to take shape under the silence of his villa. With a sharp mind, Galileo did not know that his notes and experiments would be the first seeds of a scientific revolution. His confinement would ultimately be the catalyst for his greatest work, which would soon be revealed. As his ideas took shape, the next phase of his life approached, a chapter that would not only explore the mechanics of motion but also leave an indelible mark. The question that everyone asked then was how this new knowledge would translate into a deeper understanding of the universe. The stillness in the village of Arcetri, where Galileo Galilei spent his final years, was not only a refuge of silence but also a space where the mind of a titan continued to challenge the boundaries of knowledge. In this context, the legacy of his final work, Discourses and Demonstrations, emerged as a manifestation of his life and his struggle. Published in 1638, this work would become a guide for future scientists, illuminating the path that would lead figures such as Isaac Newton to discover the fundamental laws of motion and gravitation. The 17th century was not an easy time for thinkers like Galileo. Europe was immersed in political and religious tensions, and science found itself at a crossroads between tradition and innovation. The Catholic Church, still grappling with the repercussions of the Reformation, maintained a firmness in its interpretation of the universe. In this environment, the publication of Discourses and Demonstrations not only represented an act of intellectual resistance, but also a challenge to established notions. The key figures in this narrative were not limited to Galileo. On the horizon loomed figures such as the natural philosopher René Descartes, whose search for a new foundation for knowledge resonated among many contemporaries. Galileo's decisions in choosing to publish his ideas in such a volatile context reflected a courage that only those at the frontier of knowledge can understand. It is pertinent to analyze what drove Galileo to risk so much, whether it was the desire for truth or a need for justice. In developing Discourses and Demonstrations, Galileo aimed to provide a profound analysis of mechanics. The work was structured in the form of dialogues, a choice that resonated with his earlier work. Dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. However, in this latest publication, his focus centered on the laws of motion, inertia, and the nature of falling bodies. The dialogue among the three characters Salviati, Sagredo, and Simplicio not only facilitated the discussion of complex concepts, but also allowed Galileo to argue in defense of his vision. The unfolding of events surrounding the publication was crucial. Despite his house arrest, Galileo remained active, using his knowledge to formulate theories that would challenge future generations. In 1638, when Discourses and Demonstrations was finally published, the impact was immediate. Scientists of the time began to take note of his ideas on acceleration and inertia, concepts that would be fundamental to modern physics. The immediate consequences of this work were manifold. As Galileo's ideas spread, the figure of Newton began to emerge on the horizon. Galileo's work not only influenced scientific thought but also sowed the seeds of a paradigm shift. However, it is debated whether his legacy was sufficient to break the chains of dogma and allow knowledge to flourish unrestricted, or if the influence of the Inquisition would continue to loom over the advancement of science. The question that hangs over this chapter is profound. How could a man, faced with the fiercest opposition, leave such a powerful legacy? It is pertinent to analyze what secrets of his thought remain hidden, waiting to be discovered in the depths of history. As Galileo's health began to decline, a new cycle approached. His final work had opened doors that still remained ajar, and his ideas would resonate through the centuries, preparing us for the next stage of his story, the declining health of a genius whose visions still shone in a world that was beginning to awaken to modern science. The trial of the Inquisition struck Galileo Galilei once again, this time in a more personal manner. While his ideas challenged beliefs, his body began to betray him. In his villa in Arcetri, science intertwined with the inevitable physical deterioration he faced. Galileo's health had become a matter he could not resolve with his calculations or telescopes. As the decade of the 1630s progressed, the historical context of Renaissance Europe became complex. The Protestant Reformation had fragmented religious unity, and the Catholic Counter-Reformation sought to reaffirm the authority of the Church. In this landscape, Galileo's ideas not only challenged science but also unleashed a theological storm. The figure of the scientist became a symbol of resistance while the Inquisition continued to monitor his life. The tension between knowledge and faith emerged as a backdrop. The years of house arrest drained his spirit. But it was not only confinement that affected his mind, his body faced progressive blindness. This condition was compounded by other physical problems. The man who had challenged the stars now struggled to find clarity in his immediate world. With each passing day, the blindness deepened, robbing him not only of sight but also of the certainty of his legacy. In this context, the family environment became crucial. His children, students, and friends became his only refuge. His daughter, Maria Celeste, shone as a light. Through their correspondence, the young woman became the emotional link that mitigated her father's sadness. The letters, filled with affection, offered Galileo a glimpse of companionship. It is debated whether this was truly enough to alleviate the weight of his suffering. The decisions he made during this final phase reflected his deterioration. Despite the loss of vision, his mind remained active, seeking to solve mysteries. Blindness not only affected his ability to observe, but also his capacity to interact with texts. However, his will to continue writing never wavered. In those moments of clarity, Galileo became a symbol of perseverance. The immediate consequences of his physical deterioration were manifold. Blindness prevented him from continuing his observations, limiting his ability to contribute. His work, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, had become a turning point, but the future of his legacy seemed threatened. The influence of the Inquisition remained present, and his inability to defend his ideas placed him in a vulnerable position. It is pertinent to analyze what secrets awaited in the depths of his mind, unable to be expressed. The central question of the chapter looming over Galileo's life is clear. How could a man who challenged the boundaries of knowledge find himself trapped in darkness, both physical and spiritual? The irony of his situation is palpable. The same man who had demonstrated the dance of the planets now found himself ensnared in his own shadow. The question persists: will his legacy survive his decaying health? As Galileo struggled to keep his mind sharp, time continued to advance. His life and work would resonate in the future, but his own existence was marked by an increasingly profound silence. As the end approached, the tensions between his beliefs and the reality of his condition intensified. In the next chapter, we will explore the conclusion of his life, the moment when the struggle of a genius culminates in his death, leaving a legacy that would change the course of science. The health of Galileo Galilei had been fading. In his final years, the blindness that had ensnared him was not only a physical challenge, but also a reflection of the struggle between his genius and the forces that had silenced him. It was 1642, a year that would mark the end of an era and the beginning of a legacy that would change the course of science. The atmosphere in Arcetri, where Galileo spent his days under house arrest, was dense, imbued with a profound sense of the inevitable. The historical context of this period is fundamental. Europe was immersed in political and social upheavals. The 30 Years' War ravaged the continent, straining the relationships between emerging science and religious doctrine. In this landscape, the figure of Galileo stood as a beacon, but also as a subject of controversy. His defense of heliocentrism had unleashed not only the wrath of the Catholic Church, but also a debate about the place that reason should occupy in the understanding of the universe. The key figures in this drama were not limited to Galileo and the Inquisition. Pope Urban VIII, who had once been a supporter of Galileo, had become an antagonist, feeling that his authority was threatened. The tension between these men, Galileo's struggle for his truth against the oppression of a system, became the backdrop of a story of betrayal and rebirth. The unfolding of events surrounding his death is remarkable. On a winter day, the 8th of January in 1642, Galileo succumbed to a series of health issues. His body, which had been an instrument of discovery, was weakened. On his deathbed, surrounded by his children and loyal friends, his mind remained vibrant. It is debated what thoughts accompanied him in his final breaths and whether he reflected on the legacy he would leave behind. The following day, the news of his death spread, provoking varied reactions. For some, it was the end of a heretic. For others, a farewell to a misunderstood genius. The immediate consequences of his passing were felt in the scientific realm, where his ideas began to take root. His observations on motion laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution. However, the influence of the Church remained present, and the repercussions of his condemnation continued. It is pertinent to analyze whether those who judged him understood the scope of his contribution. The question raised by his death is profound. It is debated whether his life was a necessary sacrifice to open the doors of knowledge or a reminder of the resistance to ignorance. As Galileo faded, a question lingered. What secrets awaited in his legacy? In the dimness of his room, Galileo ceased to breathe. However, his soul seemed to rise like the celestial bodies he had studied. His theories, although condemned, began to resonate more and more. As time progressed, science began to echo his voice, and his legacy transformed into a hope for future generations. The chapter of his life had closed, but the impact of his work was just beginning. With each new discovery, the name of Galileo emerged, claiming the place it deserved. The lingering question was how this new rebirth would affect modern science. As his writings became new truths, the next chapter in the history of Galileo was preparing to explore the impact of his ideas on the development of modern science, a journey that would delve into the heart of the scientific revolution that was yet to come. The uncertainty that loomed over Galileo in his final days not only reflected his personal struggle but also foreshadowed the repercussions of his ideas. As he emerged from his confinement, his discoveries began to resonate in the minds of those seeking a different path. In this chapter, we will delve into how the ideas of Galileo Galilei not only transformed his time but also laid the foundations of modern science. The historical context of 17th century Europe is essential. In an era of Renaissance, intellectual curiosity had been reborn. However, this flourishing of knowledge existed in a delicate balance with the power structures of the Catholic Church. The struggle between the heliocentrism of Copernicus, defended by Galileo, and the traditional geocentrism represented a dilemma between reason and faith. Among the key figures in this narrative was Galileo, but also individuals such as Pope Urban VIII, who initially had shown sympathy towards Galileo only to turn against him. Urban's decisions, influenced by the pressure from the cardinals, would mark a turning point. The condemnation of Galileo in the year 1633 was not only an attempt to silence a scientist, but also revealed the fragility of a system that feared losing its authority. The events that followed Galileo's condemnation were crucial. Isolated in his villa in Arcetri, the scientist continued his work, writing works that delved into mechanics. His treatise, Discourses and Demonstrations would become a pillar of physics, inspiring minds such as Isaac Newton, who would build upon the foundations that Galileo had established. Galileo's work was a hymn to the scientific method, observation, experimentation, and the formulation of theories based on empirical evidence. The immediate consequences of Galileo's discoveries were profound. The idea that the Earth was not the center of the universe began to penetrate the consciousness of the scientific community. This paradigm shift allowed for advancements in fields such as physics and astronomy. New ways of thinking were established that challenged the authority of the Church. However, it is pertinent to analyze whether this transformation was a linear process. Persecution and fear persisted, leading many thinkers to be cautious. The question that this stage leaves us with is profound. How could a single individual, through the use of telescopes and mathematics, alter the course of science? What secrets lay within his writings that still resonate? The figure of Galileo stands as a symbol of the struggle for knowledge, but also as a reminder of the dangers of challenging authority. As history progresses, Galileo's legacy is found not only in the advancements he inspired, but also in the way his life intertwines with the future of humanity. In the next chapter, we will explore how the Catholic Church, after centuries of controversy, revisited Galileo's case, recognizing the value of his contributions and his role in the history of critical thought. It is pertinent to analyze whether truth, even in its darkest moments, always finds the light. The trial of 1633 loomed over the figure of Galileo Galilei for centuries, a weight that had become an integral part of his legacy. However, as time progressed, a subtle yet significant change began to take shape in the heart of the Catholic Church. The crisis of faith and reason, which had led a brilliant scientist to renounce his convictions, would soon find an echo in the quest for reconciliation. By the end of the 20th century, the world was in a context of renewed search for truth. Scientific convictions had evolved, and the relationship between science and religion was beginning to be re-evaluated. In this environment, the figure of Galileo emerged as a symbol not only of conflict but of the pursuit of knowledge. It was in this context that the Catholic Church decided to embark on a path toward the rehabilitation of Galileo, an act that would resonate among scholars, scientists, and believers. The first step toward this redemption began in 1979, when Pope John Paul II announced the intention to review the case. In a bold move, the pontiff convened a group of experts to analyze the trial. This analysis aimed not only to review the facts, but also to understand the background that had led to the condemnation. The decision to address this dark chapter was an act of self-criticism that marked a turning point. However, the rehabilitation of Galileo was not limited to an apology. The Church faced a challenge: how to reconcile Galileo's scientific vision with its teachings. In an attempt to achieve this reconciliation, the Vatican organized conferences where Galileo's contributions were explored. In 1992, Pope John Paul II delivered a speech in which he acknowledged the errors made in the trial, a moment of great anticipation. "Scientific convictions can change," he said, "and as a church we must be able to discern the truth." This acknowledgement was not only an act of justice, but also an attempt by the Church to position itself in a new era, an era where science and faith need not be in conflict. The figure of Galileo, who had been condemned, now resurfaced as a bridge between two worlds. It is debated whether it was an act of redemption or a strategy by the Church to modernize its image. The answer faded into the mists of history. The rehabilitation of Galileo had profound consequences. his legacy was revitalized in a contemporary context. Universities began to re-evaluate his work, leading to a resurgence of interest. Studies on Galileo multiplied, generating a new appreciation for his courage. However, the rehabilitation also left unanswered questions about whether the Church had truly changed or if it was an attempt to appease criticism. The question of the chapter of Galileo's rehabilitation persists. The story of a man who challenged conventions resonates with new generations, inviting them to question and seek the truth. As the new millennium progressed, Galileo's legacy intertwined with popular culture, becoming a symbol of the struggle for freedom of thought. As the story of Galileo intertwines with the evolution of the Church, a question arises: what other secrets remain hidden in the history of science and religion? As the figure of Galileo becomes an icon, the path toward reconciliation between science and faith remains fraught with complexities. In the next chapter, we will explore how the figure of Galileo has transformed into a symbol in popular culture, a reflection of modern dilemmas regarding science, truth, and belief. His story, now filled with nuances, invites reflection on the eternal conflict between different forms of knowledge. The story of Galileo was not limited to the pages of books. His figure has been an inexhaustible source of inspiration in popular culture, an influence that has endured over time. In this chapter, we will unravel how the iconography of Galileo has been represented and reinterpreted in various cultural expressions, revealing not only his historical importance but also how his legacy continues to resonate today. As the Renaissance flourished, a new way of thinking began to take shape, challenging old beliefs. In this context, Galileo Galilei emerged as a central figure, a pioneer whose astronomical observations transformed the understanding of the universe and attracted the attention of artists and writers. The figure of Galileo became a symbol of the struggle for truth, an archetype that would resonate for centuries. The impact of Galileo on literary narrative is undeniable. Since the 17th century, writers such as the Italian playwright Carlo Goldoni and the English poet John Milton began to incorporate the figure of the scientist into their works, using his story as a mirror to explore themes of freedom of thought. In works such as Paradise Lost, Milton evokes the genius of Galileo as a representation of the struggle between light and darkness. It is pertinent to analyze what attracted writers to his figure, whether it was his story of persecution or something deeper. Art has also been influenced by the figure of Galileo. Painters such as Artemisia Gentileschi and Giovanni Battista Tiepolo have left their mark, sometimes emphasizing his conflict with the Catholic Church. In works such as The Death of Galileo, the dramatic tension of his trial is captured, where knowledge clashes with dogma. These representations not only document a historical moment, but also raise questions about the cost of knowledge. There is debate over whether art is merely a reflection of history or if it has the power to change it. In the 20th century, the figure of Galileo became even more prominent, becoming a symbol of the conflict between science and religion. Theatrical works such as The Life of Galileo by Bertolt Brecht not only dramatize his story but also address philosophical questions about the responsibility of the scientist. In this context, Galileo becomes a tragic character, caught between his passion for truth and the forces that seek to silence him. Brecht's work poses a question: to what extent are we willing to sacrifice our convictions in the name of the established order? Cinema has also embraced the figure of Galileo, with films that explore his life, from documentaries that analyze his legacy to dramatizations that exploit his conflict with the Inquisition. The narrative of Galileo has been adapted for new audiences. Films such as Galileo, directed by Liliana Cavani, not only portray his life but also invite reflection on the challenges faced by thinkers. It is pertinent to analyze what lessons we can draw from his life in a world where science often faces skepticism. Beyond literature and art, the figure of Galileo has found its place in music and philosophy. Composers have created works inspired by his life, while poets have used his story as a metaphor. The resonance of Galileo is also felt in contemporary science. where his legacy becomes a guide for new generations. In a world where knowledge continues to be threatened, the figure of Galileo serves as a reminder of the cost of the pursuit of truth. However, despite his prominence, a question persists around his figure. How is it possible that a man whose life was marked by struggle managed to transcend his time and become an icon? The answer may lie in his ability to inspire others to question and explore. The influence of Galileo, his quest for answers, and his challenge to authority resonate in popular culture. But this reflection on his legacy is not limited to admiring his genius. It invites us to question our own beliefs. In a world where science and religion are often in conflict, the legacy of Galileo reminds us that curiosity is essential for progress. As we delve into the next chapter, we will explore the broader debate about science and religion that the case of Galileo has sparked. The figure of Galileo, a martyr of scientific truth, becomes the symbol of a struggle that continues. The secrets of this millennia-old conflict are still being investigated. The story of Galileo is just the beginning of a deeper exploration. The story of Galileo manifested palpably, reflecting the growing tension between science and religion. In the 17th century, Europe was engulfed in a whirlwind of changes where the Protestant Reformation resonated. The Catholic Church, in an attempt to maintain its authority, clung to the traditional interpretation of the scriptures, while new scientific ideas began to challenge the perception of the world. With Galileo Galilei at the center, his story would become a symbol of the struggle between scientific reasoning and dogmatic faith. The historical context of this chapter is set in a divided Europe. In Italy, the Holy See wielded significant power. The Inquisition, established to eradicate heresy, became a feared instrument. In this hostile environment, Galileo, with his ingenuity, dared to challenge the geocentric view, a perspective blessed by the Church. Among the key figures stands Pope Urban VIII, who was initially a supporter of Galileo. Their relationship was complex. Urban VIII had been a close friend, but when Galileo published his work, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, in the year 1632, the situation changed. The work, which advocated for the heliocentric system, was perceived as a mockery of the papal stance, with the character of Simplicio representing the Pope's ideas. Urban VIII's decision to allow Galileo to publish became one of the most controversial. It is pertinent to analyze whether friendship may have blinded the Pope. The development of events accelerated in the year 1633 when Galileo was summoned to appear before the Inquisition. His arrest and trial became a media spectacle. As the accusations of heresy piled up, the tension increased. Galileo's defense, which was based on the premise that his discoveries did not contradict faith, was insufficient. In this climate, Galileo was forced to recant, a decision that could be interpreted as an act of survival. The immediate consequences were devastating. Galileo was sentenced to house arrest, a fate that isolated him. However, in the silence of his villa in Arcetri, he continued to work, once again challenging conventions. His work, discourses, and mathematical demonstrations relating to two new sciences became a symbol of resistance. However, it is pertinent to analyze the cost and whether the price of truth was the freedom to express thought. The question of the chapter lies in whether science and religion could coexist without conflict. The story of Galileo is not only that of a man acclaimed for his contributions, but also that of a martyr in the struggle for freedom of thought. His legacy not only challenges the conception of a universe in which reason and faith stand on opposite sides, but also invites reflection on the nature of knowledge. As we delve into the next chapter, we will explore how Galileo has been viewed throughout history as a symbol of the struggle for scientific truth, becoming a martyr who inspires generations. We will analyze what secrets awaited in his legacy and how his figure has evolved in popular culture. The answer will lead us to a new dimension of his immense impact. The struggle between reason and faith not only shook the foundations of thought but also cemented the figure of Galileo Galilei in history as a symbol of the pursuit of truth. Born into a world where dogmatic beliefs prevailed, Galileo rose as a beacon of rationality. In his investigations, he faced not only the resistance of his time but also the question of how humanity could reconcile science with religion. As his legacy unfolded, it would transform into an emblem of the fight for intellectual freedom. Historical context. At the beginning of the 17th century, Europe was in a state of intellectual and spiritual upheaval. The Protestant Reformation had challenged the authority of the Catholic Church. In this environment, the heliocentrism of Copernicus, which Galileo defended, was not merely a theory, it was a challenge to the geocentric view rooted in Christian doctrine. The Inquisition, in its role as guardian of orthodoxy, was preparing to act. In this context, the figure of Galileo emerged forcefully as a martyr of scientific truth, key characters and decisions. The actors in this drama were varied. On one side was Galileo himself, a man of science whose tenacity led him to challenge the norms. Opposite him stood the authoritative figure of the Catholic Church, represented by Pope Urban VIII, who had initially welcomed Galileo but whose patience would soon be exhausted. Galileo's decision to publish his findings in works such as the Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems not only earned him admirers but also enemies. His choice to challenge the Inquisition would become one of the most significant decisions of his life. Development of events. The year 1633 would become a milestone. Accused of heresy, the scientist was summoned to appear before the Inquisition in a trial that would resonate through the centuries. During this process, tensions reached a boiling point. The atmosphere in the room was tense. Galileo, aware that his theories challenged faith, confronted his accusers with a mix of humility and defiance. The pressure was intense, and while the ecclesiastical authorities maintained that the literal interpretation of the scriptures must prevail, Galileo defended his position with logic and evidence. Ultimately, in an act of pragmatism, Galileo publicly abjured his ideas. This moment left an indelible mark on his legacy. There is debate over what this abjuration truly meant, whether it was a sign of weakness or a strategy to protect his life and continue his work. The answer would not be simple. Immediate consequences. The consequences of this trial were profound. Galileo was sentenced to house arrest, a prison that threatened to silence his voice. However, even in his villa in Arcetri, his mind remained active, generating ideas that would influence generations. History would remember him not only as a persecuted scientist, but as a martyr who did not abandon his quest for truth. The repercussions of his abjuration would resonate in academic and ecclesiastical institutions, turning his figure into a symbol of the struggle between reason and faith. The story of Galileo would not only become a tale of persecution, but also a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge can entail sacrifices. The enigma of the chapter. As we delve into the figure of Galileo, a question arises. What does it mean to be a martyr of scientific truth? Is the struggle for knowledge a solitary path? The figure of Galileo stands as a question that invites reflection on the cost of truth. His story confronts us with the question of how science and religion can coexist. The contrast between his abjuration and his legacy poses a tension that persists. The story of Galileo is not only a testament to his time, but also a warning about the dangers of silencing curiosity. Through the centuries, his figure has inspired scientists, becoming an icon of resistance. In a world that still faces similar dilemmas, the symbolism of Galileo remains alive. The story of Galileo Galilei is a journey through the mysteries of the human condition, the struggle for understanding, and the conflict of reason against faith. In his legacy, we find not only a scientist, but a symbol of the fight for freedom of thought. As we move into the next chapter, we will reflect on the lessons of tolerance that emerge from his story. The figure of Galileo invites us to question how we can establish a dialogue between different forms of knowledge, a journey that could be key to the future. it is pertinent to analyze whether we will finally learn to coexist. The tension and conflict surrounding the figure of Galileo Galilei not only marked his life, but also left a significant impact on the history of human thought. Confronted by the rigidity of a church that saw his discoveries as a challenge, Galileo became a symbol of intellectual resistance, but also of the urgent need for dialogue and tolerance between different forms of knowledge. In this chapter, we will reflect on these lessons that emerge from his life and that still resonate today. At the beginning of the 17th century, Europe was immersed in an environment of profound transformations. The scientific revolution was beginning to take shape, challenging ancient notions. However, this flourishing of knowledge was not a linear process. The fear of the unknown and the need for social control were palpable. The Protestant Reformation had fractured religious unity, and the Catholic Counter-Reformation sought to reaffirm the power of the Church. In this context, the heliocentrism of Copernicus, defended by Galileo, stood as a challenge not only scientifically but also theologically. The characters involved were varied. On one side, Galileo, the scientist who advocated for a universe governed by the laws of physics. On the other, the Catholic Church, represented by figures such as Pope Urban VIII, who had initially shown sympathy towards Galileo. However, the relationship between the two would become tense as the implications of his discoveries became evident. There was debate over how the Church could accept a model of the universe that displaced the Earth from the center. Events unfolded with unsettling rapidity. Following the publication of Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems in 1632, Galileo not only argued in favor of the heliocentric model but also satirized his opponents. This was the trigger that led the Inquisition to take action. In 1633, the trial that would condemn him was completed. The pressure on Galileo intensified, and his abjuration before the Inquisition was more than an act of humiliation. It was a lament for the future of science. It is analyzed whether it was an act of betrayal to his principles or a pragmatic measure. The immediate consequences were devastating. Galileo was not only deprived of his freedom, but an intellectual repression was unleashed. The condemnation of Galileo served as a warning to other thinkers, who saw in his fate a clear message about the limits of knowledge. Intolerance towards new ideas became the norm. It is pertinent to analyze what secrets awaited in the depths of this conflict. Could Galileo's legacy be a beacon of hope? Despite the shadows, Galileo's journey leaves us valuable lessons about tolerance. Science cannot thrive in an environment of fear. Each discovery requires a space where the diversity of thought is respected. In this sense, Galileo's case becomes a mirror reflecting the struggle for intellectual freedom. His life invites us to question our own beliefs and to consider that knowledge is not a monolith but a constantly changing mosaic. The story of Galileo is an invitation to open our minds and to engage in sincere dialogue between science and faith, between past and future. However, the path towards reconciliation is arduous. Looking towards the future, the figure of Galileo remains a source of illumination. The need for mutual understanding, for respect towards different forms of knowledge, is more relevant than ever. History teaches us that despite conflicts, there is always room for dialogue. In the search for answers, we find ourselves at a point where Galileo's legacy leads us to explore not only his life, but also the impact that his teachings have today. Science and religion should not be seen as enemies, but as allies in the pursuit of truth. With this reflection, we delve into the final chapter, where we will explore how Galileo's legacy persists, illuminating the path towards a future where science and culture intertwine. We will analyze how his figure has evolved in the contemporary era and what lessons we can draw to face the challenges of the current world. The trial of 1633 resonates in the corridors of time, an echo that invites us to reflect on the legacy of a man who challenged ignorance and dogma. Galileo Galilei not only changed the way we understand the universe, but also sowed the seeds of a scientific revolution that would flourish despite the adversities. Now, at the end of this journey, we find ourselves at a threshold that invites us to explore how his legacy remains alive in contemporary science and culture. The historical context of this legacy begins in a world that, despite having advanced, still struggles with the same tensions that Galileo faced. In the 21st century, science and religion continue in a delicate balance. The repercussions of the defense of heliocentrism are felt in contemporary debates about climate change, genetic research, and space exploration. It is pertinent to analyze whether the story of Galileo is a warning or a hope. The characters who shaped the legacy of Galileo are numerous, from his contemporaries such as Johannes Kepler and René Descartes to modern figures like Stephen Hawking and Neil deGrasse Tyson. All have taken inspiration from Galileo's courage. His decisions not only challenged the Catholic Church but also opened discussions about the ethics of science. There is debate about what decisions we would make today at a similar crossroads. The development of events that led to the perpetuation of Galileo's legacy is an intricate tale. From the publication of Sidereus Nuncius to his condemnation for heresy, each step was an act of defiance. His invention of the telescope was a tool that allowed him to look beyond and challenge accepted truths. Throughout the centuries, his legacy has been used to advocate for freedom of thought. It is relevant to analyze how we might apply these lessons in a world often divided. The immediate consequences of his actions manifested in the way science began to be perceived. Galileo not only opened a path to heliocentrism, he also established a new methodological approach that prioritized observation. The scientific community that emerged after his death was fundamental to the development of modern physics. His ideas laid the groundwork for the work of Isaac Newton and other thinkers. It is relevant to analyze what impact these ideas would have on the future. However, the question that persists is how this legacy has been interpreted and sometimes misinterpreted. The figure of Galileo has been used both as a symbol of resistance and of controversy. There is debate about whether his message has been distorted, adapted to the agendas of those seeking to justify their own beliefs. As science advances, the legacy of Galileo invites critical examination. Today, the legacy of Galileo manifests in multiple facets. From scientific education to his representation in film, his story continues to capture the imagination. Authors and filmmakers have explored his life, presenting him not only as a scientist but as a hero of intellectual freedom. His figure is a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge often requires courage. It is pertinent to analyze how we can honor his legacy. In the scientific realm, the impact of Galileo is undeniable. The methodology he advocated has become a pillar. Today, scientists continue to use his principles to unravel the mysteries of the universe. The exploration of Mars and research in quantum physics owe their existence to Galileo's bold break. There is debate about what mysteries still await us. The legacy of Galileo also extends to the social sphere. His struggle for freedom of thought resonates in current debates about censorship. In a world where misinformation can spread, his story reminds us of the importance of questioning. The fight for truth, which Galileo exemplified, remains relevant. It is pertinent to analyze whether we are willing to be defenders of the truth. Finally, the legacy of Galileo Galilei is a testament to human capacity to challenge conventions. It leaves us with profound questions about our relationship with knowledge and authority. In his quest, it reminds us that the value of questioning is what drives progress. Thus, as we conclude this journey, we face an inescapable truth. The pursuit of knowledge never stops. In every discovery, his spirit remains alive, guiding those who dare to look towards the stars. There is debate about what secrets of the universe still await and who will be the next to unravel them. On the horizon of time, the legacy of Galileo endures, a beacon in the vast darkness.